Thank you, Nicola. Thank you, Dominic, very much for the introduction, and thanks for having me with you. I guess it's afternoon for you. It's morning for me. So I'm going to draw on some, I guess, a couple of different research projects I have ongoing. Some work on Averroes on intellect and some work on Avicenna on intellect. And I'm going to be drawing on especially an article that's now been accepted at Philosopher's Imprint on Avicenna's doctrine of abstraction and emanation. So according to two regnant interpretations of Avicenna and his epistemology, he either diametrically opposes Averroes on intellectual abstraction of intelligibles, or else he just holds the exact same view. I argue in this paper, and I'll briefly repeat the argument here, that there should be a different conception of Avicenna on the active intellect's emanation and abstraction. And I think it can resolve the exegetical debate, but it also suggests an interesting reassessment of Avicenna and Averroes on the nature of abstraction. So Avicenna's position is distinct, on my view, because abstraction is a truly emanated power from a separate active intellect. But if I'm correct, Avicenna also turns out to hold a more robust and, at least by some measures, a more Aristotelian view of intellectual abstraction than his supposedly arch-Aristotelian rival Averroes. So I'll just get into it. So let me give you some brief background on the debate on Avicenna between the emanationists and the abstractionists. So these are the two camps, the two erstwhile camps on Avicenna. So the traditional view is the emanationist view. Can you hear me okay still, Nicola? Okay. The traditional view of Avicenna is the emanationist view that says the separately existing eternal active intellect that has all the intelligibles emanates those intelligibles directly to human minds when those minds are suitably prepared. And so there are interesting texts that they can draw on. On the other side, the abstractionists say, no, there are all these interesting texts where it looks like Avicenna just thinks you can abstract the intelligible concept from sensory images in a more Aristotelian fashion. So I want to point out that this debate has to do with the first acquisition of intelligibles. The two sides actually agree that Avicenna doesn't have a true doctrine of intellectual memory. So everyone agrees that in order to recall some previously grasped concept, I have to sort of reconnect with the active intellect, and then the active intellect really does emanate the intelligible directly to my mind. And that's because Avicenna thinks there's no real way for my intellect to store an intelligible unless it's actively currently thinking about that intelligible. So they sort of have to remain in the separate active intellect. So everyone agrees that when it comes to recollection or intellectual memory, it's an emanationist picture where the active intellect emanates the intelligible to the human mind. Let me just make sure I'm watching my time here. Started my timer. So this is about the first acquisition of intelligibles. Where do we get those concepts in the first moment of grasping them? So again, emanationism is the classic view, and it's a more Neoplatonic picture of Avicenna. And also, it sets up Avicenna as subject to later criticism from Averroes and Aquinas, as we'll see later, that this is an un-Aristotelian picture because it doesn't involve the sensory images, or it doesn't sufficiently involve the sensory images in the process of coming to gain the intelligibles. The images are supposed to be merely preparatory, but really all the work is being done by this emanation of the separate active intellect. I think the main problem with emanationism is that it fails to account for a lot of texts that suggest that you can abstract the intelligible from the sensory images. In particular, there are many texts where it looks like abstraction is constitutive for Avicenna of the grasp of an intelligible, not just preparatory for some separate emanation. So if you have your handout, look at text 1. This is an interesting passage that comes directly after a very debated chapter in Book 5, Chapter 5 of the Psychology of the Shifa, the healing. And so 5.5 has a very controversial passage, which I'll come to later. But then at the beginning of 5.6, he begins this way in text 1. We say that the soul understands takilu by taking into itself the form of intelligibles abstracted from matter. The form is abstracted either by the intellect's abstraction, tajrid, of it, or because the form is already abstract in itself from matter. And in the latter case, the soul is saved the trouble of abstracting it, tajrid again. So this looks to me like it's a sort of summary of what's come before, and it looks very much like abstraction is constitutive of the understanding of the human intellect. The main protagonist in this passage is the human intellect and the human soul, not the separate active intellect. So this looks like, I think, pretty good evidence that's often ignored for a more sort of abstractionist picture. There are all sorts of other texts I could point you to, and you could read the full article for that, or look at the influential cases for abstractionism from Dag Hassa and Dimitri Gutas. I should also mention that Avicenna uses a wide range of terminology across his texts for abstraction. So sometimes he uses intaza'a, or tufrizu, or yukhalisu, or even naqala, which is more Farabian language for abstraction. But the most common language he uses is forms of jarrada, so to abstract or to strip. And we see this kind of wide vocabulary in other classical sources of abstractionism. So not just Al-Farabi, but in Themistius, in the Arabic Themistius, in the Arabic Alexander, for instance, you see this sort of thing. On the other side, I think the main problem with abstractionism is they've tried to solve some of the puzzles by saying, look, all the emanationist texts have to do with this recollection of a previously grasped intelligible. So that's really an ontological question of where the intelligibles are stored after we abstract them, but it doesn't have anything to do with the epistemology of gaining the intelligibles. So they have this ontology-epistemology split, and they say, look, emanationism just explains ontology, and abstraction is how we actually get the concepts when we're talking about epistemology. I think that split doesn't really work because there are so many texts in which it looks like even at the first acquisition of the intelligible, the active intellect is playing a primary role in that process somehow. And we'll see some of these passages as we go along. So the criticism of a kind of pure abstractionism is made very well in some somewhat recent articles by Tommaso Alpina, I think, who may be joining you later in the semester, or he's already joined you, I can't remember on your schedule, and also Richard Taylor. Okay, so my view is an attempt at a conciliatory position. And my view is that the active intellect emanates, in the first acquisition of intelligibles, the power of abstraction itself. And so I think this can do better justice to the text that we have, because it still gives a preeminent role to the active intellect in every first acquisition of the intelligible, but it also sort of gives us our own power of abstraction, which we then use on the sensory images in order to abstract the intelligible concept. So let me just run through a few of the texts quickly. I may not be able to read all of these, but start with text 2 on your handout. This is from the Najat. He says, the relation of this thing, the active intellect, which I abbreviate as AI, to our souls, which are intellect and potentiality, and to the intelligibles, which are potential intelligibles, is like the relation of the sun to our powers of vision, which are seeing in potentiality, and to the colors which are potentially visible. When contact with the potentially visible things occurs from this effect, that is, the ray, they become actually visible, and the power of vision becomes actually seeing. In the same way, a power, kowa, emanates tafidu from this active intellect, proceeding to the objects of the imagination which are potentially intelligible, and it, that is the power, makes them to ja'aluha, actually intelligible. And it makes the potential intellect an actual intellect. So here, especially at the end, you get the active intellect clearly emanating a power to us. He doesn't explicitly say the power is the power of abstraction, but it certainly looks like that's what it's doing, because the power makes the potentially intelligible images to be actually intelligible, which is a very standard classical way of just putting the doctrine of abstraction in people like Themistius and Alexander. Another text is text 3 from the Compendium on the Soul. This is an early text. I think I'm going to skip it for the sake of time, but you have it there. Again, we have the active intellect emanating by its essence alone the power of perception, and here he means intellectual perception, upon the human rational power. And so this is a good text that seems to suggest the AI emanates the power of abstraction itself. Now for the very controversial passage from the Psychology 5.5. There are lots of different ways you could translate this passage, and almost every line has something that's problematic. I'm going to read through it here, or most of it, and then I'll talk about some of the key elements. So this is text 4 on your handout. When the intellective power examines the particulars which are in retentive imagination, and the light of the active intellect in us, which we mentioned, shines on them, they, the particulars, are transformed into something abstracted from matter and its attachments, and they are impressed in the rational soul. Not in the sense that they, the particulars themselves, are transferred from the imagination to our intellect, and not in the sense that the intention, the mana, immersed in the attachments of matter, which in itself and in consideration of its essence is abstract, makes a copy of itself. And this is a very key part, this section C. Rather, it's in the sense that the perusal of them, that is the particulars in imagination, prepares the soul so that the abstract light from the active intellect emanates upon them. يَفِيدَ عَلَيْهَا الْمُجَرِّدُ مِنْ الْعَقْلِ الْفَعَلِ. Thus, when some relation to this form takes place for the rational soul through the mediation of the illumination of the active intellect, from the form, something of the form's kind in one way and not of its kind in another occurs in the soul. Just as when light falls on colored things, it produces from them an effect in vision which is not identical with them in every way. Hence, the images which are potentially intelligible become intelligible in actuality, not they themselves, but rather what is collected from them. But just as the effect coming by the mediation of light from the sensible forms is not itself those forms, but rather something else related to them, coming to be by the mediation of the light and the recipient facing the enlightened objects, so also when the rational soul examines these imaginative forms and the light of the active intellect hits upon a kind of contact with them, the soul is prepared so that the abstractions, mujarradat, of these forms, out of their material admixtures, occur within it through the light of the active intellect. Okay, a couple of brief things to point out. So in C, a lot hangs on exactly how to read and interpret this al-mujarradu in section C. So that's just, it's likely a passive participle, although it could even be an active participle, which would be even stronger for my case, since the text is you don't have the vowels in it, it's unvocalized. So it could be al-mujarridu, in which case my case would be even stronger, that this is an abstracting light from the active intellect. But even in the passive, the question is, what is this abstract light or this abstract thing? Emanationists are going to argue that it's the intelligible form itself. But I think because of other texts in Avicenna, this can only be the power of abstraction. It's an abstract light that's abstract in itself. And as we'll see, Avicenna thinks that in order for something to do the kind of abstracting, intellecting work, it already has to be in some way itself abstract. And so it's of a piece with his larger system, in my view. Also, I want to point out that Section B is often pointed to by emanationists to suggest that he's ruling out abstraction here, because he seems to suggest that you can't have a transfer from the imagination to the intellect, and that's the kind of Farabian language of transferring something from the imaginary power to the intellect. But I think the only thing he's ruling out there is that he's certainly ruling out that the image itself can't be transferred directly to the intellect. It has to be abstracted. So it can't be that the image itself is transferred to the intellect. And he's also ruling out that the ma'ana within the image, the intention, could make a copy of itself, right? If it could make a copy of itself, then you wouldn't need a power of abstraction. Images would just do this by themselves. So those are the two things I think he's ruling out, which in no way rules out that he thinks there's actual abstraction going on here. I can talk about that more later if there are questions. Okay, there's a lot of other evidence that I go over in the full article. There's a really interesting passage from his text on actions and powers, or actions and affections rather, where he calls the active intellect not just the giver of forms, which is pretty standard in Avicenna's metaphysics, but also the giver of forms and powers. So we have good evidence to think that Avicenna thinks powers are forms, or a specific kind of form that the active intellect is also responsible for emanating. And so it's not unusual, or it's not out of character for him to think that the active intellect could emanate a power. So the benefits of the view is that it basically makes sense of all the texts. It shows that abstraction is a real process that human beings and their intellects do with their own power of abstraction. And that's why you have all these abstractionist type of texts, but it also shows why the active intellect plays a necessary role in even the first acquisition of the intelligibles, because it's necessary for the active intellect to emanate the power to us. We don't have that power already as part of our material or potential intellect. That's partly how the active intellect moves our potential intellect into actuality. This is interesting because it aligns Avicenna much more closely with Al-Farabi, who's generally taken to be some sort of abstractionist. And Dag Hassa has already pointed this out. But Avicenna has a lot more detail, actually. He develops this view in much more detail than Al-Farabi does. Interesting for our purposes today is that it also brings him much closer to the later Muslim philosopher Averroes, who's obviously known as a staunch Aristotelian and an abstractionist. One more thing before I move on to Averroes. How does abstraction work in Avicenna? He gives us a good text in text 5. This is also from the Najat, which follows on your text 2. This is what he says. Just as the sun is visible in itself and a cause of visibility because it makes the potentially visible actually visible, so also this substance, that is the AI, is intelligible in itself and a cause of intelligibility because it makes the potential intelligibles become actual intelligibles. But the thing which is intelligible in itself is also an intellect in itself. For the thing which is intelligible in itself is the form abstracted from matter, surat al-mujarrada and al-mada. and especially if it is abstract, mujarrada, in itself, and not through another. And this thing, the AI, is also the actual intellect, because if this thing is eternally intelligible in itself, in actuality, it's also an actual intellect. So what's interesting in this passage is that abstraction, the same language of abstract, mujarrada, can be used both for things that are abstract in themselves, or eternally abstract or separate from matter in themselves, like the active intellect, he says here, but also the form once it becomes abstracted, once it's made to become abstract from being at one point not abstract in itself, but rather abstracted through another, namely through some intellect that abstracts it. So you get both senses of abstract here. And this is the passage that tells you that something already has to be abstract in itself if it's going to be an abstract intellect, or if it's going to perform some operation of abstraction. So that's what the active intellect does for us when it gives us this power of abstraction. It basically gives us the power of intelligibility, the power of being an actual intellect, and such that we can look on the images which are potentially intelligible, and then we transfer that power of abstraction to them. Why does it need to do this? Because our intellects are not sort of fully abstract in themselves from the get-go. We're attached to our bodies at the beginning, and we sort of have to be gradually separated from the matter of our bodies over time. That's just what it means to be a human being on Avicenna's view. And we do that through a contact with an actual intellect, an eternally actual intellect, and we become more and more an actual intellect in ourselves, and then we're able to do that to images. So it's a power transfer of intelligibility or abstractness, you could think. Okay, happy to talk about that more in Q&A. Let's see how we're doing. Okay. All right, so what does Averroes think about Avicenna? I'm interested in general. This is another sort of long-term research project I have in what Averroes knows of Avicenna, how much he actually knows this psychological view, whether he portrays it fairly, and so forth. So I'm interested today just in the idea of abstraction. We see, I think, a pretty clear, although it's not by name, we see a pretty clear criticism of Avicenna in Averroes' long commentary on the De Anima. And the same criticism actually appears in Thomas Aquinas, for those of you who are familiar with the Latin tradition. So this is text 6 on your handout now. So text 6, now we're on Averroes texts. And this is from the long commentary on the De Anima. He says, "For we cannot say the relation of the agent intellect in the soul to the generated intelligible is just like the relation of art to the artifact in every way. For art imposes the form on the whole matter without something of the intention of the form existing in the matter prior to the art making it. It is not so in the case of the intellect, for if it were, then a human being would not need sense or imagination for grasping intelligibles. But rather the intelligibles would come into the material intellect from the agent intellect without the material intellect needing to look at sensible forms." Okay, so I think this is a pretty clear case where he's looking at Avicenna in the traditional emanationist view, that Avicenna thinks the images merely prepare the intellect to receive the intelligible directly from the active intellect. And Averroes' criticism of this view is that essentially it's un-Aristotelian. It doesn't give the sensory images the proper kind of role in the coming to grasp of an intelligible. So he says, look, if this is the way it could go, the material intellect wouldn't need to look at these sensible, imaginative forms at all. We could just get the intelligible directly from the active intellect. And this would be like art imposing the whole form on the matter. So when the artist takes a completely unmolded lump of clay and makes a statue out of it, it doesn't already have, Michelangelo doesn't already have David in the lump of clay. He's got it in his mind, and he imposes the whole form on the clay. And Averroes says that's not quite right. We shouldn't think of the active intellect doing that sort of thing, because there's actually something of the form already in the matter here. There's the intention in the imaginative form. And what the active intellect does is not completely impose the form on the intellect, but rather takes out the form that's already there out of the matter and then impresses it onto the intellect from the image. Okay, so I think this is a pretty clear criticism of Avicenna here. And there are certainly passages in Al-Ghazali, for instance, where Al-Ghazali suggests a kind of emanationist interpretation of Avicenna as well. So he's in line with a certain tradition of reading Avicenna this way. But interestingly, I think we can see the influence of Avicenna in other cases, cases where Averroes might not be so happy with himself if he came to reflect on these passages a little more. So look at text 7. This is in comment 18 of book 3 of the LCDA. Averroes says, "It is as if Aristotle says, the way that forces us to posit the agent intellect is the same as the way in which vision needs light. For just as vision is not moved by colors, except when they are in act, which is not completed unless light is present, since it extracts them from potentiality into actuality, so also the imagined intentions do not move the material intellect except when they are made intelligibles in act, because it is not completed by them unless something else is present, which is an intellect in act." So I think this passage is interesting because he's at odds with Aristotle's particular text, which compares the active intellect to light. And it goes against his own theory of vision. So Averroes would say Averroes' own position of vision, but also Aristotle's own theory of vision. So Averroes, with Aristotle, thinks that colors are already actual in the things in the world. What light actualizes is not the colors, but the transparent medium. But this passage actually sounds a lot more like Avicenna, in whose theory of vision, what the light does is it actualizes the colors. The colors are merely potential for Avicenna, and the light actualizes the colors. So that's the position that we get in this passage from Averroes, which I think may show the influence of Avicenna, because he also doesn't help himself to a little caveat that's in Aristotle's own text, because Aristotle says it's in a way like light. The active intellect is in a way like light, tropontina. I think it's quo modo in the Latin of Averroes. So he could help himself out of this with Aristotle's own text, but he doesn't, and instead he just goes with the very traditional dominant Avicennan view that you've got this really strong analogy between the active intellect and the sun. Okay, other interaction between Avicenna and Averroes on abstraction. I want to point out actually that so there are these criticisms of Avicenna, but also I think other clues that show that he's influenced by Avicenna. But the interesting thing for me is that even though Averroes is known as this kind of arch-Aristotelian, clearly an abstractionist, there's not a whole lot of detail to abstraction in Averroes. You don't get a lot of fleshing out of what abstraction really is. Instead, what you get is largely a repetition of what we already see in Avicenna. And so I don't see anything new in Averroes on the doctrine of abstraction. And so even if Averroes thinks that he's the more Aristotelian person who understands abstraction in the right way, Averroes seems to suggest that the language for abstraction and the mechanics of abstraction have already sort of been laid out by Avicenna, so he doesn't really need to explain it very much. Let me give you a few instances of this. So he offers a definition which is repeated several times in the long commentary on the De Anima. Once it's expanded slightly with this Farabian language of transfer. So if you look at text 8, this is where you get this very standard definition of abstraction with a little bit of this transfer language. So Averroes says, for to abstract is nothing other than to make imagined intentions intelligible in act after they were in potentiality. So that's the formula. We already see that in Avicenna, including in text 2 that I gave you. So that's just the standard definition of what it means to abstract. And he says to understand is nothing other than to receive these intelligible intentions in act. For when we found the same thing, that is the imagined intentions, is transferred in its being from one order into another order, we said that this is necessarily from an agent cause and a recipient cause. Thus, the recipient cause is the material intellect, and the agent intellect is the efficient cause. So you get a little bit more detail there with this idea of transfer, but I've actually found the transfer language also in other texts in Avicenna. So this isn't even entirely skipping over Avicenna from Farabi to Averroes here. But that's about the most you ever get. Most of the time, it's just that standard definition in Averroes, making imagined intentions to be intelligible in actuality from potentiality. Let's see. He previews this basic definition of making potential intelligibles into actual intelligibles in Comment 4 of Book 3. And that's an interesting passage because we have a corresponding Arabic fragment. So this is passages 9 and 10 on your handout. I'll just read passage 9, which is from the Arabic fragments. Aristotle says that intellect is among the active powers because it creates the intelligibles by abstracting them from matters. Yujarraduha min al-muwad. So that's a very Avicennian passage too. I've got lots of passages from Avicenna that support this idea that Avicenna frequently calls the intellect an active power, precisely because it seems to make the intelligibles. So we definitely are looking at the same concept because we've got the Arabic confirmation there that he's thinking of abstraction with this jarrada language. Let's see. Close to finishing. Sometimes Averroes, similar to Avicenna, and others uses more sort of stripping language like denudere in Latin, and seems to define that equivalently to jarrada language, just as abstraction. So it's stripping the intelligible concept from the images. Interestingly, also in Averroes, it's not just the activity of abstraction, but also this broader sense of being ontologically abstract. Averroes picks up the same idea that something can be abstract in itself, not needing abstraction. And if something is abstract in itself, that's just what it means to be an intellect in act, an intellect in itself, or intelligibility in itself. Let me point you to text 12. This is a very Avicennian sounding passage. The inner sense faculties present the image of the sensible thing so that the rational power may look upon it as abstracted and to extract the universal intention and afterward receive it, that is, to comprehend it. So this is an interesting Avicennian passage where it's got this language of the rational power looking at the images. You see that in the controversial text 4, I think it was, from text 4 from 5.5, where the rational power has to look at the sensible images. But it's interesting that it looks on it as abstracted, abstracta. Whether this is referring to the products of abstraction or looking at the imagined intentions as if already abstracted, or whether it's talking about the rational power itself here, either way, I think you get this more sort of ontological sense of something being abstract. And there are lots of other passages where Averroes has this idea that the products of abstraction then are abstracted, and something that's purely an intellect, like the active intellect or the material intellect, indeed, on Avicenna's view, is abstract in itself or intelligible in itself. That's just what it means to be an intellect. But again, he's drawing on the firm Avicennian tradition here. I think he implies something like the grades of abstraction. Avicenna is somewhat famous for describing these grades of abstraction, where the sensible form becomes more and more abstract as it goes through the inner sense faculties, finally to the level of intellect. Averroes has the same idea, and that's probably in part because they're both drawing on a common text, which is the Arabic adaptation of Aristotle's Parva Naturalia. And let's see what else I have time for here. Yeah, I guess I'll wrap up Averroes on that point and to suggest that, again, in terms of the space devoted to abstraction, there's less in Averroes than there is in Avicenna, and there's less detail. And I really don't see him going beyond Avicenna in any real way. So if I'm right about Avicenna, this means that he's sort of the preeminent abstractionist in the Islamic tradition, even if he wasn't read that way by people like Averroes, and by most scholars until, well, I should say most 20th century and 21st century scholars until relatively recently. Let me suggest one other contrast between Avicenna and Averroes, which again might make you think that it's actually Avicenna who has a slightly more Aristotelian view of abstraction. So Avicenna consistently portrays our soul or our intellect as being the thing that abstracts. And that's important on my view, because he describes the active intellect as emanating the power to us first. So it's not actually the active intellect that's doing the abstracting, at least on my view. You could look at text 3 for an interesting confirmation of that, where he actually says the power that comes from the active intellect is emanated to our rational power. So the active intellect sends it to our rational power first, and then we do the abstracting on the images. So it's important for my view that Avicenna doesn't think that it's the separate active intellect doing the abstracting. It's our rational souls or intellects that are doing the abstracting. Whereas for Averroes, it's the separately existing active intellect that does the abstracting for him. He's very clear about that. It's the separate active intellect that does the abstracting. You've seen that in some of the passages I've given you. For instance, passage 8, where he says the efficient cause here is this separately existing active intellect that does the abstracting. And of course, for Averroes, there's only a single eternal material or possible intellect for all human beings as well. So you've got these two eternal intellects that are involved in this process. And then, of course, the classic criticism of Averroes is, in what way are human beings really involved in this intellectual process? Do we have intellects at all? Do we understand, right? This is the criticism of Aquinas and others. Averroes has something to say to that. If you look at text 13, he says it's necessary to attribute these two actions, namely to receive the intelligible and to make it, to the soul in us, although the agent and the recipient are eternal substances. Because of this, these two actions are reduced or brought back to our will, that is, to abstract intelligibles and to understand them. So these two actions don't really belong to us, Averroes says, but they belong to the separate intellects, the eternal substances. Nonetheless, they can be attributed to us because these actions take place by our willing them. So it's our will that kicks off these acts of understanding and the acts of abstraction. And of course, this idea of a habitus actually just becomes standard in the medieval tradition. And they quote this same passage from Averroes as saying, look, to have a habitus just means to be able to do something at will. And so this is enough to attribute the powers to us, but in fact, these actions are of separate substances. So if you're looking at this picture, and if I'm right about Avicenna, you might think, well, look, Avicenna is actually more Aristotelian here, because whatever Aristotle thinks, if he's an abstractionist at all, he thinks that we do the abstracting. If the act of intellect is some sort of power in us, it's something that we do to the images. So you might think Avicenna's got that in his view, if I'm right. But Averroes has this kind of it's more attenuated in terms of thinking of the abstraction as something that we do. It's a possibility. You might push back on it, but I think I'll end there for your questions and comments. Thanks.